October 25th, 1944. Surigao Strait, Philippines. Japanese Admiral Nishimura commanded 7 warships steaming through pitch-black waters, confident his force would annihilate the American fleet waiting ahead. His crews trained for decades in night combat, an art Japan perfected while America slept. But 26 miles away, American radar operators saw every ship as clearly as daylight. The Japanese had no idea they were already dead. December 7th, 1941, 7:48 a.m. Pearl Harbor burned under a sky thick with black smoke that blocked the Hawaiian sun. The smell of burning oil mixed with cordite hung so heavy that sailors 2 miles offshore could taste it. Commander Ernest Evans stood on the deck of USS Johnston, watching the battleship Arizona settle into the harbor floor, taking 1,177 men with her. The temperature was 78 degrees. The water was calm. America's Pacific Fleet was dying. But Pearl Harbor wasn't the beginning. It was confirmation of what Navy strategists in Washington had feared since 1937. Japan owned the night. At Savo Island in August 1942, Japanese cruisers emerged from darkness like phantoms, sinking 4 Allied cruisers in 32 minutes. American lookouts saw nothing until Japanese searchlights blazed and shells were already airborne. At Tassafaronga, 4 months later, 8 American cruisers ambushed 8 Japanese destroyers and lost. The Japanese sank 1 cruiser, crippled 3 more, and vanished into darkness without losing a single ship. American casualties, 800 men. Japanese casualties, fewer than 100. The numbers told a story of systematic failure. Japanese crews trained obsessively in night optics, learning to detect ships by phosphorescence in wakes, by silhouettes against star fields, by the smell of smoke on wind currents. Their Type 93 Long Lance torpedoes ran 40,000 yards at 48 knots, triple the range of American torpedoes, twice the speed, and left no bubble trails. American destroyer captains called them ghost torpedoes because ships exploded before anyone knew they'd been fired at. In Washington, D.C., in a classified briefing room 3 stories beneath the Navy Department building on Constitution Avenue, Rear Admiral Julius Führer convened a meeting that would remain secret for 30 years. The date was January 15, 1943. Outside, snow fell on the National Mall. Inside, 16 officers sat around a mahogany table scarred with coffee rings and cigarette burns, reviewing casualty reports that painted a picture of technological obsolescence so severe it threatened America's ability to win the war. "Gentlemen," Führer began, spreading reconnaissance photographs across the table, "in 11 major surface actions since Pearl Harbor, we have engaged Japanese forces at night 6 times. We lost 4 of those engagements completely. We achieved tactical draws in the other 2. We are losing the night war, and if we cannot solve this problem, we will lose the Pacific." The statistics were devastating. American optical fire control systems required visual acquisition, a human eye identifying a target through binoculars or a rangefinder scope. On a moonless night, maximum visual detection range was 8,000 yards under ideal conditions. In rain, fog, or battle smoke, that range collapsed to 2,000 yards or less. Japanese crews consistently detected American ships first, fired first, and maneuvered away before American guns could respond. The Imperial Japanese Navy had perfected night combat through 2 generations of training. Changing American tactics wouldn't overcome a 50-year cultural advantage. But Lieutenant Commander Arleigh Burke, a 41-year-old destroyer squadron commander who'd survived Guadalcanal, proposed something radical. "We don't need better eyes. We need to see without eyes." The room went silent. An admiral leaned forward. "Explain." Burke stood, pointing to a technical schematic pinned to a corkboard. "Radar. We've been using it for aircraft detection, for navigation, for early warning. But MIT's radiation laboratory has been developing something different, fire control radar that can detect surface ships at ranges beyond visual acquisition. calculate firing solutions automatically, and direct guns without a human ever seeing the target. The British used primitive versions at the River Plate in '39. We've had experimental sets at sea since '42, but we haven't integrated them into doctrine because admirals trained in the old Navy don't trust shooting at something they can't see. Another silence. Then Captain George Murray, who'd commanded the carrier Enterprise at Midway, spoke quietly. How accurate? At Guadalcanal in November, Burke said, the cruiser Minneapolis detected a Japanese formation at 23,000 yards in total darkness using SG radar. That's 12 miles, 3 times the maximum visual range. She got a firing solution 4 minutes before Japanese lookouts saw our ships, but her gunnery officer didn't trust the data. He waited for visual confirmation before opening fire. By the time we fired, the Japanese had already launched torpedoes. We lost Minneapolis's bow to a long lance hit, 63 men killed in the forward compartments. Führer leaned back, his chair creaking in the silence. What do you need? Burke's answer was immediate. I need radar sets on every destroyer and cruiser in the Pacific Fleet. I need fire control systems redesigned from scratch to use radar as primary input, not backup. I need gunnery doctrine rewritten to permit firing on radar contacts without visual acquisition. And I need it done in 12 months, because if we don't own the night by the time we hit the Philippines, we'll fight the Imperial Japanese Navy on their terms, and we'll lose. The room erupted. Old line battleship admirals called it insanity. You couldn't trust machines over trained human eyes. Gunnery officers argued that radar couldn't distinguish friendly ships from enemy ships in the chaos of night battle. Logistics officers said installing new equipment on hundreds of ships while fighting a two-ocean war was impossible. Bureau of Ordnance representatives said the technology wasn't mature enough for fleet-wide deployment. But Führer silenced the debate with a single question. Do we have another option? No one answered, because everyone in that room knew the truth. Japanese sailors trained their entire careers for night combat. American sailors learned gunnery in daylight on sunny ranges off Virginia Beach. Doctrine couldn't overcome that gap. Training couldn't overcome it. The only solution was technological. Give American ships the ability to see in the dark better than Japanese lookouts could see, and give them the ability to fire accurately at targets they couldn't see with human eyes. The decision was made. Project Zebra would retrofit the Pacific Fleet with the most advanced fire control radar systems ever deployed at sea. It would happen in 18 months instead of 12. Logistics and production schedules made faster deployment impossible. It would cost $47 million, equivalent to building 3 destroyers. It would require training 30,000 sailors in technology so new that training manuals were being written as ships left port. And it would be classified at the highest level, because if Japan learned that American ships could target in total darkness, they would develop countermeasures or change tactics before the technology could deliver decisive advantage. On February 1, 1943, the first destroyer entered Puget Sound Naval Shipyard in Bremerton, Washington, for Zebra retrofit. 600 more ships would follow. The race was on, and every day it took to complete was another night the Japanese owned the darkness. March 15, 1943, 11:20 p.m., Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, Bremerton, Washington. The temperature was 44 degrees. Rain hammered the corrugated tin roof of Assembly Building 7 with a sound like continuous machine gun fire. Inside, under harsh work lights that turned everything yellow, 147 technicians worked the night shift, installing Mark 8 fire control radar aboard the destroyer USS Fletcher. They'd been at it for 16 hours straight. Coffee urns sat empty, ashtrays overflowed. No one was going home. Ensign Robert Hicks, a 23-year-old electrical engineering graduate from Carnegie Tech in Pittsburgh, stood on scaffolding 3 decks above the waterline, feeding coaxial cable through a conduit that wasn't designed to accommodate it. His hands were raw from sharp metal edges. His back ached from working in a crawl space designed for steam pipes, not human bodies. The cable caught on a structural beam. He swore, backed out, repositioned, tried again. This was the 14th attempt. The cable had to route from the radar antenna on the fire control tower to the plotting room below decks without crossing power lines. Electromagnetic interference would render the system useless. "How we doing, Hicks?" Chief Petty Officer Dennis Kowalski appeared at the bottom of the scaffold, a cigarette dangling from his lips. Kowalski had served 22 years in the Navy, most of it in engine rooms where you fixed machinery with a wrench and intuition. Radar baffled him. He trusted things he could touch, things that moved when you pushed them. Radio waves were invisible. How could you shoot at something a machine told you was there if your eyes said nothing existed? 15th time's the charm, Chief, Hicks said, feeding the cable again. This time it slid through. We're gonna make believers out of every gunnery officer in the fleet. They ain't gonna believe it, Kowalski said flatly. I seen the reports from training exercises. Radar says targets at 12,000 yards bearing 280. Gun director swings that direction. Officers look through the optics, see nothing. You know what they do. They override the system, go back to visual search, waste 3 minutes finding the target manually. You can give them all the technology in the world. If they don't trust it, it's ballast. Hicks climbed down, wiping his hands on a rag already black with grease. Then we make it impossible to ignore. We make it so accurate, so reliable, that refusing to use it gets you killed. That was the challenge. The technology itself was revolutionary. Magnetrons generating microwave pulses that bounced off steel hulls and returned as echoes. Cathode ray tubes displaying contacts as bright green blips. Analog computers calculating range, bearing, and speed automatically. The SG surface search radar could detect a cruiser-sized target at 25 miles. The Mark 8 fire control system could track 6 targets simultaneously and generate firing solutions faster than any human fire control team. In theory, an American destroyer could engage a Japanese cruiser in total darkness from beyond visual range and land shells on target before the Japanese even knew they were under attack. In theory. In practice, the challenges were cascading. The radar sets were temperamental. Salt spray corroded connections. Tropical heat caused components to overheat. Vibration from gunfire knocked systems offline. Installation required ripping out equipment and rerouting electrical systems on ships that were still fighting the war. Destroyers left port half-finished, completed retrofits at forward bases between combat missions, and hoped nothing failed in the middle of a battle. Training was brutal because the technology was so new that instructors were learning alongside students. Maintenance required skills that most sailors didn't have. Vacuum tube electronics, oscilloscope diagnostics, radio frequency theory. At Naval Training Station San Diego, Lieutenant Sarah McKinley supervised a training program that ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. McKinley was one of 47 women in the Waves, women accepted for volunteer emergency service, assigned to technical training roles. She taught physics at Berkeley before the war. Now she taught radar theory to sailors who'd been farmers in Iowa, mechanics in Detroit, clerks in Brooklyn. Most had never seen a vacuum tube before. They had 8 weeks to become experts. The magnetron generates microwaves at 3,000 megahertz. McKinley explained to a class of 30 exhausted sailors at 2 a.m., pointing to a cross-section diagram of the device that was the heart of every radar set. Those waves propagate from the antenna, travel at the speed of light, reflect off any conductive surface, meaning metal ships, and return to the receiver. The time delay between transmission and reception tells us range. The bearing of the antenna when we receive the echo tells us direction. The Mark 8 computer integrates this data with gyroscopic input for ship motion, wind sensors for ballistic correction, and predictive algorithms for target movement. It generates a firing solution and transmits it electrically to the gun mounts. The entire process takes 1.2 seconds. A hand went up. Seaman First Class James Chen, 19 years old, son of Chinese immigrants who ran a laundry in San Francisco's Chinatown. "Ma'am, what if the target changes course?" The system tracks continuously, McKinley said. As long as the target is within radar range, the computer updates the firing solution every second. If the target turns, the solution adapts automatically. This is faster and more accurate than any manual fire control team, because humans can't process that much data that quickly. Another hand. Seaman Michael Santorini, from a neighborhood in South Boston where every family had someone in the Navy. What if the radar breaks? McKinley smiled grimly. Then you're back to manual fire control, visual acquisition, and praying the Japanese don't see you first, which is why you're going to learn to maintain this equipment in your sleep. You're going to memorize every component. You're going to practice troubleshooting until you can diagnose a fault by the pattern of noise from the power supply. Because in a night battle, there's no time to consult a manual. The radar works, or your ship dies. Your choice. The class went silent. The weight of it settled over them, the knowledge that their skill, or lack of it, would directly determine whether their shipmates lived or died. By October 1943, 340 ships had been retrofitted. By April 1944, that number reached 580. The Pacific Fleet was transforming into something unprecedented, a force that could fight as effectively in total darkness as in daylight. But technological advantage meant nothing without tactical doctrine to exploit it. That fell to Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, a 57-year-old battleship commander from Riverside, California, who'd survived Pearl Harbor aboard the West Virginia and spent 2 years rebuilding her from the harbor floor. Oldendorf understood something fundamental. Radar didn't just give American ships better targeting. It gave them the ability to dictate the terms of engagement. If you could see the enemy before he saw you, you could position your forces optimally before the first shot. You could cross his T, the classic naval tactic where your entire broadside engages his leading ships, without him knowing he was in a trap until your shells started landing. You could turn night combat from chaos into choreography. He developed the doctrine in exercises off Hawaii, drilling destroyer squadrons and cruiser divisions in radar-directed night attacks until the procedures became instinctive. Destroyers formed picket lines, using radar to detect approaching forces at maximum range. They'd vector cruisers into firing positions without ever closing to visual range. Battleships formed a stationary line, radar-directed guns trained on predicted intercept points. When the enemy came within range, American ships would open fire simultaneously from multiple bearings, overwhelming Japanese defenses before they could respond. The Japanese had no idea this capability existed. American ships maintained radio silence about radar performance. After-action reports were classified. When Japanese forces survived encounters with radar-equipped American ships, they attributed accurate American fire to luck, superior optics, or brilliant seamanship, never to technology they didn't know existed. By October 1944, the trap was set. General MacArthur's forces were invading Leyte in the Philippines. The Imperial Japanese Navy was committing everything. 4 carrier groups, 7 battleships, 19 cruisers, 35 destroyers, in a desperate attempt to destroy the invasion fleet. Japanese planners knew this was their last chance. If they lost the Philippines, the war was over. They had to win, and they planned to win the way Japan always won at sea, through superior night fighting. They had no idea they'd already lost. Because for the first time in history, the night didn't belong to the side with better trained eyes. It belonged to the side with radar. And in Surigao Strait, Rear Admiral Oldendorf was waiting with 28 radar-equipped ships, every one of them tracking Japanese Admiral Nishimura's force from the moment it entered Philippine waters. The Japanese were steaming into the most perfectly executed ambush in naval history, and they wouldn't know it until their ships started exploding. October 24th, 1944, 11:37 p.m., Surigao Strait, Philippines. Admiral Shoji Nishimura stood on the bridge of the battleship Yamashiro, watching black water slide past the hull. No moon, Heavy cloud cover, visibility less than 1,000 yards. Perfect conditions for what the Imperial Japanese Navy did best. His force, 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, 4 destroyers, was steaming north at 18 knots toward Leyte Gulf, where American amphibious ships sat undefended. Intelligence said Admiral Oldendorf's force was still 20 miles north. Nishimura would arrive at dawn, catch the Americans repositioning, and slaughter them in the confusion. It was the same tactic that worked at Savo Island, at Tassafaronga, at a dozen engagements where Japanese crews proved that discipline and training trumped American industrial production. What Nishimura didn't know, what he couldn't have known, because Japanese naval intelligence had never detected it, was that 78 miles north, in the radar rooms of 6 American battleships and 8 cruisers, operators were watching his entire formation on green glowing cathode ray screens. They'd been tracking him since he entered Mindanao Sea 4 hours ago. They knew his course, they knew his speed, they knew exactly where he'd be in 30 minutes. And Oldendorf had positioned his entire force in a perfect cross, every battleship and cruiser forming a horizontal line across Nishimura's path of advance. Every gun trained and ready, every fire control radar locked on targets the Japanese didn't know existed. At 2:56 a.m. October 25th, Nishimura's lead destroyer Asagumo detected something wrong. Lookouts reported flashes on the horizon, American PT boats, small and fast, launching torpedoes from extreme range. Asagumo maneuvered, evading easily. Nishimura wasn't concerned. PT boats were nuisances. His force pressed forward. The battleship's crew remained at battle stations, but confidence remained high. They'd trained for this. Night combat was Japanese mastery. At 3:16 a.m., the destroyer Yamagumo exploded. No warning, no indication of attack. One moment the ship was steaming in formation. The next moment, a massive explosion tore through her engineering spaces. She listed, burning, and began to sink. Survivors reported no torpedo wakes, no sounds of incoming shells, just sudden, catastrophic destruction. Nishimura assumed mines. He ordered the formation to continue. They were too close to turn back now. What actually killed Yamagumo was a coordinated torpedo attack by American destroyers that had approached from the east, using radar to position themselves perfectly without ever being detected visually. The Japanese never saw them. The destroyers launched torpedoes from 8,000 yards, then turned and fled into darkness before Japanese lookouts spotted their wakes. At 3:51 a.m., hell arrived. Nishimura's force entered Surigao Strait proper, and suddenly, from 15 miles ahead, far beyond visual range, far beyond where any rational naval commander would expect contact, American battleships opened fire. Not a ranging salvo, not exploratory shots. A full broadside from 6 battleships simultaneously, 108 heavy guns firing in perfect synchronization, shells arcing through darkness toward targets the Japanese couldn't see and didn't know were under attack. The first salvo straddled Yamashiro. Enormous columns of water erupted on either side of the battleship, drenching the deck with spray that felt like being hit by a fire hose. Bridge officers shouted in confusion. How were the Americans shooting? There was nothing on the horizon, no muzzle flashes visible through the darkness, no searchlights, no visual indicators of enemy position. It was as if shells were materializing from empty night sky. The second salvo landed. 3 14-inch shells hit Yamashiro amidships, punching through armored deck and detonating in the forward engine room. The ship shuddered, losing speed. Fire erupted from ruptured fuel lines. Damage control teams rushed to contain flooding, but they were fighting blind. They didn't know where the next shells would land, didn't know how to maneuver because they couldn't see what they were maneuvering away from. On the bridge, Nishimura made a decision born of 50 years of naval tradition and every lesson learned from a generation of night combat victories. Charge. If you couldn't see the enemy, close the range. Force visual contact. Engage at close range, where Japanese optical superiority would reassert itself. Yamashiro increased speed despite the damage, turning toward where the shell trajectories suggested American ships waited. It was exactly the wrong decision, because Oldendorf's radar operators watched Yamashiro turn on their screens and immediately transmitted updated firing solutions to every ship in the American line. When Yamashiro changed course, American guns adjusted automatically, tracking the movement with mechanical precision that no human fire control team could match. The third salvo was devastating. 5 shells hit Yamashiro simultaneously. Turret hit that killed 37 men instantly. Hit below the waterline that flooded 2 compartments. Hit on the superstructure that destroyed fire control systems. Hit on the aft deck that started uncontrollable fires. The battleship was dying, but she kept coming, her crew fighting with desperate courage against an enemy they still couldn't see. The cruiser Mogami fared no better. American cruisers opened fire at 3:53 a.m., their radar-directed 8-inch guns landing shells from 18,000 yards, 9 miles, in total darkness. Mogami's captain, standing on his bridge trying to identify targets through binoculars, saw nothing. His lookouts saw nothing. His fire control teams saw nothing. But his ship was being systematically destroyed by shells arriving from bearing 340, from ships that Japanese optics couldn't detect because they were simply too far away for visual acquisition in darkness. What made the Japanese situation hopeless wasn't just that American radar could see farther, it was that American ships were fighting a completely different battle. Japanese crews were trying to fight a traditional night engagement, visual detection, rapid closure, point-blank gunnery, torpedo attacks in the chaos of close combat. American crews were fighting an analytical battle, radar detection, mathematical firing solutions, standoff engagement from beyond Japanese response range. The Japanese were fighting 19th century tactics. The Americans were fighting 20th century technology warfare. At 4:09 a.m., Yamashiro capsized. Nishimura went down with his ship, along with 1,636 crew members. The battleship rolled to port, her huge hull visible for a brief moment as a black silhouette against fires burning on the water, then slid beneath the surface. Survivors clung to wreckage, watching the rest of the Japanese formation steam past them toward the American line, not knowing they were already ghosts. By 4:19 a.m. it was over. The destroyer Michishio exploded and sank. The destroyer Asagumo lay dead in the water, burning. Mogami turned south, heavily damaged, leaking oil, listing 15 degrees, trying to escape. Only the destroyer Shigure survived intact, fleeing south at maximum speed, her captain understanding that continuing north meant certain death. In the radar rooms of American battleships, operators watched the contacts on their screens begin to disappear. Ships that minutes ago showed as bright green blips now faded, blinked out, vanished. Target tracking solutions turned red as computers registered contacts lost. Not because radar failed, but because the targets ceased to exist. Japanese intelligence officers would spend weeks trying to understand what happened in Surigao Strait. Reports from Shigure described accurate American fire from impossible ranges. Survivors spoke of shells arriving without warning, from directions where no ships were visible. Some theorized secret American optical systems. Others suggested Americans had placed artillery on islands flanking the strait. A few suspected long-range aircraft dropping bombs in darkness, though no aircraft were detected. Not one Japanese report mentioned radar, because the concept was outside their tactical framework. The Imperial Japanese Navy knew radar existed. They'd developed their own systems for aircraft detection. But radar directed surface gunnery in total darkness, firing at targets beyond visual range, hitting consistently from 15 miles away. That capability seemed impossible. Japanese doctrine held that naval gunnery required visual spotting for accuracy. No machine could replace the trained human eye. That doctrinal blindness cost Japan 7 ships and over 4,000 sailors. But more critically, it cost them their psychological advantage. For 3 years, Japanese crews entered night battles confident. Their training gave them superiority. After Surigao Strait, that confidence shattered because the survivors knew something unprecedented had happened. They'd been destroyed by an enemy they never saw, using weapons they didn't understand, in conditions that should have favored Japanese victory. The night no longer belonged to Japan, and every Japanese sailor knew it, even if they didn't know why. October 25th, 1944, 7:23 a.m. Aboard USS West Virginia, Admiral Jesse Oldendorf stood on the bridge watching sunrise paint Surigao Strait gold and orange. The smell of cordite still hung in the air. The sea was calm. Oil slicks marked where Japanese ships had gone down. Black stains spreading across blue water, surrounded by debris and bodies. His battleship had fired 93 16-inch shells during the engagement. Radar fire control logged 87% hits, accuracy that would have been impossible using visual fire control in darkness. He felt no triumph, only exhausted relief. The battle was won. The invasion fleet was safe, but 4,000 men died before sunrise. The strategic implications were immediately clear to American Naval Command. For the first time in the Pacific War, American surface forces had achieved complete tactical superiority in night combat, the one domain where Japan had consistently dominated. The Battle of Surigao Strait wasn't just a victory, it was proof that technological innovation could overcome generational cultural advantages. Japan had spent 50 years perfecting night combat. America spent 18 months installing radar and rewrote the rules of naval warfare. But the deeper transformation wasn't tactical, it was epistemological. Surigao Strait marked the moment when human observation ceased to be the limiting factor in military operations. For thousands of years, warfare depended on what soldiers could see with their eyes. Radar shattered that limitation. American ships didn't need to see targets to destroy them. They needed mathematics, electronics, and trust in machine data over human perception. That required a fundamental shift in military culture, accepting that instruments could perceive reality more accurately than trained human senses. That shift didn't come easily. After Surigao Strait, Navy investigators interviewed officers from every ship in Oldendorf's force. The reports revealed persistent skepticism even after decisive victory. Gunnery officers admitted they'd questioned radar contacts before opening fire, looking for visual confirmation that never came. Some described profound discomfort firing at targets they couldn't see. It felt wrong, almost cowardly, like shooting an unarmed man. Traditional naval honor was built on visible courage, closing with the enemy, engaging in fair combat, winning through superior seamanship and gunnery skill. Radar combat eliminated that visibility. Victory came from mathematics and electronics, not heroism. Lieutenant Commander Ernest Evans, captain of the destroyer USS Johnston, summarized the cultural tension in his after-action report. We detected enemy formation at 41,000 yards using SG radar, generated firing solution and prepared to launch torpedoes, but training said don't fire until visual confirmation. Doctrine said machines fail, trust your eyes. Every instinct said wait, but the radar was right and my eyes were useless. We launched torpedoes at a target we couldn't see and hit. That's the new Navy. Effective, but it feels like we've lost something. What they'd lost was certainty built on human perception. What they'd gained was capability that transcended human limitations. That trade defined modern warfare. The transformation rippled beyond night combat. By November 1944, radar fire control became standard doctrine for daytime engagements. Ships used optical systems for visual identification, but relied on radar for targeting, fire control, and damage assessment. Accuracy improved dramatically. Gunnery hit rates climbed from 15% in early war engagements to over 60% by 1945. Japanese ships found themselves outranged, outgunned, and unable to close to effective range before suffering catastrophic damage. The strategic consequences were decisive. In January 1945, during the Battle of Lingayen Gulf, radar-equipped American cruisers detected and destroyed a Japanese cruiser force in pre-dawn darkness before Japanese ships came within visual range. In April 1945, during Operation Iceberg at Okinawa, radar-directed gunfire provided continuous fire support for amphibious operations, regardless of visibility conditions, smoke, or darkness. Japanese defenders who'd planned to exploit night attacks found American ships engaging them accurately 24 hours a day. The tactical advantage Japan had relied on for the entire war simply ceased to exist. But Surigao Strait's legacy transcended tactical innovation. It established the template for post-war military development, technological superiority through applied science, integration between civilian research and military operations, willingness to discard traditional doctrine when technology rendered it obsolete. The partnerships forged between MIT's Radiation Laboratory, Naval Research Laboratory, and Pacific Fleet commanders became the model for Cold War defense research. The officers who learned to trust radar data over visual observation became the admirals who built the post-war Navy around guided missiles, nuclear propulsion, and computerized combat systems. The human cost of that transformation remained unspoken. In the radar rooms and fire control centers, sailors watched green blips on screens disappear and knew they represented men dying. The abstraction troubled some deeply. Seaman James Chen, who'd learned radar theory at 2 a.m. in San Diego training rooms, described it in a letter to his parents. "I track targets on the screen and transmit data to the guns. Numbers and bearings. I never see the ships, never see the men. When a contact disappears, I report target destroyed and track the next one. It's efficient, it's effective, but I can't stop thinking about the crews on those ships who never knew what hit them. We won because we could see and they couldn't. Is that victory or just technological murder? That moral ambiguity became characteristic of modern warfare, precision that eliminated traditional honor, effectiveness that created ethical distance between killer and killed. Radar fire control was the beginning. Guided missiles, drones, autonomous weapons would follow the same pattern, increasing capability, decreasing human connection to consequences. The Japanese crews who survived Surigao Strait carried psychological scars that never healed. In post-war interviews, survivors described the battle as fundamentally incomprehensible, being destroyed by an invisible enemy, having no opportunity to fight back, dying without seeing your killer. Traditional military honor was built on mutual risk. Radar combat was asymmetric. American ships faced minimal risk while inflicting maximum destruction. To Japanese sailors trained in Bushido principles, that asymmetry felt dishonorable, even as they intellectually understood it was effective warfare. Admiral Oldendorf retired in 1948, decorated and celebrated. He died in 1974 at age 87, having witnessed the Navy he served transform from battleship-centered force to nuclear-powered fleet built around principles validated at Surigao Strait. Technological advantage, information superiority, standoff engagement. His funeral was attended by officers who'd served under him, men who'd learned to trust machines over instinct, who'd fired at targets they couldn't see, who'd won battles through applied mathematics rather than traditional seamanship. Lieutenant Sarah McKinley, who taught radar theory to exhausted sailors at 2 a.m., returned to Berkeley after the war. She became a professor of electrical engineering and spent 40 years teaching the next generation about the technology she'd helped deploy. She died in 1989. Her obituary mentioned her wartime service in one sentence. The thousands of sailors she trained, the men whose understanding of radar made Surigao Strait possible, remembered her with reverence because she'd given them the tools to survive and win. Ensign Robert Hicks, who'd spent 16 hours routing coaxial cable through impossible spaces, stayed in the Navy and became an admiral. He commanded the first Aegis cruiser, equipped with computerized combat systems that descended directly from the radar fire control he'd installed 40 years earlier. He understood something fundamental. Surigao Strait wasn't just a battle. It was the moment American warfare became a collaboration between human judgment and machine capability, a partnership that would define military operations for the next century. The ships that fought at Surigao Strait were scrapped by 1960. The radar sets were obsolete by 1950, but the principle they validated, that information superiority trumps physical courage, that seeing first means winning decisively, that trusting technology over human perception enables capabilities impossible through traditional methods, that principle became doctrine. Every naval engagement since Surigao Strait has been shaped by radar, by sensors that extend human perception, by computers that process data faster than human minds. In October 2024, on the 80th anniversary of the battle, the US Navy held a memorial ceremony in Leyte Gulf. Veterans who'd served on radar-equipped ships, men in their late 90s, the last survivors of that generation, attended. They remembered the green glow of cathode ray screens, the tension of firing at targets they couldn't see, the relief when radar contacts disappeared, meaning the threat was eliminated. They remembered shipmates who died in earlier battles before radar made American ships untouchable in darkness. And they remembered the fundamental truth that Surigao Strait proved. In modern warfare, the side that sees first, that processes information fastest, that trusts technology to extend human capability beyond biological limits, that side wins. Not through courage or tradition or superior training. Through applied science, operational integration, and willingness to discard doctrine that technology has rendered obsolete. The night no longer belonged to anyone. It belonged to whoever had better senses. And in October 1944, in a strait in the Philippines where 4,000 men died before sunrise, America proved it had built the future of naval warfare. One radar set, one trained operator, one commander willing to trust machine data over human eyes at a time. That was the lesson. That was the legacy. That's why 80 years later, every warship on Earth still fights the way Oldendor fought at Surigao Strait, seeing with electronics, thinking with computers, trusting technology to reveal what human eyes cannot perceive. If this story of innovation, courage, and technological transformation moved you, hit that subscribe button and join our community exploring the untold stories of World War II. Drop a comment below. What other hidden technologies changed the course of the war? Your engagement helps us bring more of these incredible histories to light. Thanks for watching, and remember, history's greatest victories often came from those who dared to see differently.